The centre bit of the park here, which is about 1,000 acres, forms the core of the estate. It's very beautiful. It was designed in about 1750 by a character called Woods, and is very much in the style of Capability Brown. Now, the entire estate covers about 5,000 acres.
At 32 years old, Lord Brocket is already a powerful man. 16 years ago, he inherited the glories of the Brocket estate and the magnificent Georgian mansion of Brocket Hall, favourite visiting place of Queen Victoria and home of Lady Caroline Lamb. Just outside Welwyn Garden City in Hertfordshire and only 20 miles from London, the estate was acquired by the Brocket family 800 years ago. It's made up of prime greenbelt land with woods, several farms and patronage over 60 estate cottages. The hall itself is now put to contemporary use. Lord Brocket runs it as a business conference centre. Several evenings a week, Lord Brocket and his wife Isa check the table settings for parties of top executives.
35 tonight.
But without any doubt, it's his land that has given him great power. What does he think are the main advantages of being a landowner?
Okay, right. I think, firstly, because of the privacy it offers. People like to feel that they're nice and private in the middle of their patch, however size their patch is, whatever size their patch is. Secondly, it offers them a security for the future, because land ownership has always proved over the last few hundreds of years a good investment for the future, and something that people tend to hold on to through its ups and its downs and its value. Land and bricks and mortar are always the things that people shout about. And I suppose there's a third thing for some people. It's like, I think, for some people, and I hope not myself, like owning a Rolls Royce. It makes a statement. It says, I have arrived.
All these benefits are underpinned by another. It's the exercise of power. To bring out the landowner's attachment to power, you have only to ask them how they would feel if it were curtailed. Much of Lord Brocket's estate is out of bounds to the public, so how would he react if he had to allow ordinary people the right to wander freely in his estate?
If we had an extreme socialist government in power, or Marxist, then this would be fine. It would be exactly what they're looking for. But the problem is that England is a democracy, and there is such a word as freehold. And freehold has certain benefits attached to it. And one of those benefits is that you can say that it's yours, and that you can use it whenever you want. And it's just yours. It is exclusively yours. Now, if everyone else is going to use it, then it's not your freehold. I mean, if somebody can drive your car parked outside your house, come and drive it any time they want, anybody come and drive it, you'd ask yourself, now, should I be paying for the upkeep? Is there any point in owning it?
Today, more and more people want to enjoy the countryside, for which Britain is renowned in many parts of the world. But all too often they find they can't. They're shut out of many of the most attractive parts, and much of the rest has been ruined. At the moment, there's not much they can do. For although we all have a say in what happens in our towns and cities through the planning system, this control is far less wide-ranging over the 80% of Britain's land that is countryside. The countryside is almost totally controlled by a tiny group of people, the owners of rural land. They do pretty well what they want with our countryside, and they don't really have to worry what the rest of us think. I think it's time that changed. Here's one reason why it should change. This is the devastated landscape near Bottersdale, Suffolk. Florence MacDonald has lived nearly all her life here. Today she goes for walks through a countryside whose creation she recalls with shock.
It was very traumatic seeing it all bulldozed and diggers going along, and then whole trees were burnt, willow trees and poplar trees. and hedgerows in between. And all the trees have gone.
Mrs. MacDonald and her husband Gordon look out from their back garden onto a transformed countryside.
We look down on lovely meadowland with gates and stiles, footpaths, and the river was different. There was frogs in the river, and there was kingfishers. All that's gone now.
It just breaks my heart. It used to be a lovely status. And you wouldn't... The first time I walked down there after this destruction, it just looked something like a scene in a battlefield from the First World War, with trees shattered and goodness knows what.
Much of the countryside has been ruined by modern farming, but here's another example of how power in the land is abused. These people from West Oxfordshire, like millions in Britain, have chosen to spend this spring day going for a walk. But these find their enjoyment comes to a sudden halt, for they've run up against the boundary of the secret forest. This is the name that locals give to Wychwood Forest, the largest ancient wood between the Cotswolds and the Chilterns. It's owned by Lord Rotherwick, a shipping magnate. He's imposed a ban on the general public. Only on one day a year, Palm Sunday, does Lord Rotherwick allow the general public to walk in Wychwood. Why can't people walk in this magnificent forest? Let's go in and find out. I was determined to find out his reasons for the ban because we tried earlier several times to get him to explain his position and got nowhere. But I had only gone a bare 200 yards before someone came to stop me.
Hello.
Hello.
No, I didn't realise it's all private in here.
Oh, I see. Are you Lord Rotherwick's agent or?
No.
Oh,
no.
I see.
It's just private in here, okay. I'm gamekeeper here. I'm doing my job. Can you trespass and stuff
where
like
can
that?
we find Lord Rotherwick? The keeper said Lord Rotherwick was at his home, so I drove up there past the private notices. Cornbury House is set amid 600 acres of beautiful deer park and lakes. At first, it was hard to get an answer at his estate office or at the house itself. But at last we did find someone who gave us a response of sorts. We're looking for Lord Rotherwick. We're making a film about the countryside, and we want to ask Lord Rotherwick about public access to the countryside. And that was as much an explanation as we ever did get from Lord Rotherwick or his staff about why he bans the general public from Wychwood. Though landowners often believe that they act responsibly, most of them ultimately hold that it's their right to decide what to do with their land. For them, land is to be treated in the same way as anything else they own, like a piece of furniture. They do not see it as a gift of God or nature from which everybody ought to benefit. But their attitude to land ownership isn't by any means the only attitude possible. Other societies have treated land in very different ways. The Maoris, in common with many so-called primitive peoples, had no conception of the ownership of land by individuals. When Captain Cook set foot in New Zealand, Maori land was owned in common by members of each tribe. Individual members owned not plots of land, but rights to carry out particular activities on the commonly owned land. When the Maori chiefs handed over their land to Queen Victoria under the Treaty of Waitangi in 1840, they could not have understood what they were signing away. Today there are still many different ways of allocating rights in land. In parts of South America, peasants cultivate only with the permission of the estate owners. In Cuba, the state owns all the land. In China, the land is owned by communes with individuals being allocated particular rights. In Saudi Arabia, land is deemed to be owned by anyone who is actively making use of it. So where did the British idea of land ownership come from? The answer is to be found in one particular historical event. Before that event occurred, attitudes to land in Britain were very different. In early Saxon England, the land was largely owned by communities of free, independent peasants. They themselves ploughed the land. There was no group of non-farming landowners. By the late Saxon period, this landowning democracy had begun to crumble. The event which gave it its death blow was the Norman invasion. The battle between William of Normandy's mounted knights and King Harold's mixed array of foot soldiers and peasants was in some ways one between different systems of values. For William's victory ushered in a Norman concept of land ownership. As his spoils, he claimed for himself the ultimate ownership of all land. The free independent peasants lost all their land rights. William granted their land to Norman barons for services rendered. Control of the land thus became rooted in a small group who could do as they liked with their lands. The great estates were in this way created, served by a subclass of serfs who could work the land for themselves only after fulfilling obligations to their lords. William especially had established landowners' attitudes to land itself. One of the most conspicuous of these was the Norman passion for hunting. Such was the Norman love of the pursuit of deer and boar that they set aside huge tracts of land for the chase. The needs of the mass of the people for food or fuel were overridden. So the private pleasure of a few was established as the legitimate use for much of Britain. Land was there for either the pleasure or the profit of landowners. Norman absolutism over land, the idea that if it's my land I can do what I like with it, has survived pretty well intact to this day in the countryside. There are no restrictions in Britain on who can own land or how much they can own, and whoever buys or inherits rural land inherits the Norman tradition of absolute control over it. So who are the people who hold such total sway over land? One popular idea is that much of the countryside today is owned by public bodies and institutions. In fact, institutions like the National Trust, the big insurance companies, the Crown Estates and the Church of England own only 6% of Britain's rural land. And all the public bodies together, including the Ministry of Defence, local councils and the Forestry Commission, own only 13%. That means that the vast bulk of the countryside is in the hands of private owners. So who are these people? An elaborate and painstaking survey of exactly who owns Britain's countryside today has been done by Professor Doreen Massey.
It showed, in fact, that over 30% of the total land area of Great Britain is still in the hands of titled aristocrats, titled landed families. And, of course, the bulk of those holdings are in vast rolling estates, which makes the ownership structure of the British countryside very, very different from the structure in, say, other European countries or in the United States of America.
But the proportion of the countryside owned by large private landowners is actually much greater than this. There are also some 1,500 families without titles who own large estates. This is part of the Luton Hoo estate in South Bedfordshire. It's all owned by Nicholas Phillips. Owner-occupier farmers are not unimportant owners, but they're not predominant. They own about a fifth of the countryside. All these groups have inherited power over land and the ancient view of land as a source of pleasure or profit. Since the war, landowners have derived profit mainly from a form of agriculture more transforming than anything known before. This is the man who is responsible for the complete transformation of the landscape at Bottisdale in Suffolk. His name is Nicholas Thornhill, and he's a very successful landowner, businessman and farmer. He doesn't own just this 1,600-acre farm at Bottisdale. He also has an estate in Derbyshire, a chateau in France, and investment interests.
How much more has he got to do over there? He's got one more bank over there, and then
Overseeing the application of fertiliser to a vast field of oilseed rape, he's the very essence of the modern farmer.
I see a farm as an extension of one's personality, and you farm as you want to. It's oneself, and that's why I like to see every farmer bring freedom. As you go around the countryside, you see different farms, and you think that's how he farms, that's how I farm, and it's just very much an extension of oneself. Modern farm, on an arable farm context, is using up-to-date machinery, growing the latest varieties of crops and trying to get the highest yields that are obtainable from your land, which means doing the right cultivations at the right time, which means economies of scale, large machinery, and unfortunately large fields as well, because economies of scale in arable farming are important. I think I'm passing on an environment which is up to date, which is modern. People's idea of modern changes, but at least what I've got here I think is as modern as I can achieve.
How would you justify so much power over landscape being left in the hands of a small number of people, like yourself?
I'd only justify it on the grounds of ownership, for freedom of ownership. I mean, so long as Britain is a country where people can own their own property, ownership means freedom.
But some people would argue that a 1,600-acre estate is the environment that belongs to us all.
No, it can't belong to us all when someone's bought it. That's it's a contradiction of terms. If it belongs to the state can either nationalise it or buy it up, or it belongs to the individual. But it cannot at one and the same time belong to the owner and belong to the nation.
In my view, it's this freedom, or licence, that landowners enjoy to do what they wish with the landscape, coupled with modern agricultural technology and massive economic support, that is wreaking so much havoc. The owners of land have ferociously attacked the old patchwork of small fields. They've got machines to rip up hedges to create the room for huge tractors and combines to work. They've energetically drained wetlands rich in wildlife. In the process, 80% of Britain's wetlands have gone. They've ploughed up downland extensively to grow grain we don't need. These old Wiltshire sheepdowns are here growing 60,000 acres of corn. And landowners have been ruthless with Britain's small woodlands, so rich in bluebells and wildlife. Since the war, a third have been cleared, often to make way for growing profitable but unwanted corn. A vast amount of archaeological sites have been lost. Over 80% of Cotswold sites have been destroyed by farmers in the last 20 years. But we are continuing to destroy much more than the countryside. One of Britain's leading landscape artists, Gordon Benningfield, believes we're also losing a part of our cultural identity.
The English landscape has influenced at least half, if not far more, of all our artists, writers and sculptors. I mean, Henry Moore, the greatest sculptor, that was so kind to me. His whole work revolves round the English landscape, even the texture of his work. Going back to wonderful painters like Constable and Turner. And then even the French Impressionists, that some came over here and was desperately concerned, and it was a wonderland for them. So that's the importance of the English landscape, and we're losing it hourly.
Gordon Benningfield now spends part of his time trying to protect small pieces of countryside, but people like him have a hard task, for they're up against the landowner's drive to use his land for wealth creation. Only very recently have the prospects of wealth creation from agriculture started to look less rosy. The grain stores of the common market are full to bursting, and at last there have been signs that the EEC may be getting round to reining in the subsidies. But landowners are casting round for other ways of loading up profits. One that's stacking up well for them is forestry. Forestry is widely seen as the government's favoured way of taking up the surplus land that it announced recently it would like to see out of agriculture. Only the mass growing and harvesting of trees, it's thought, can possibly absorb this excess 2 million acres of land. On the face of it, forestry certainly seems plausible. This sawmill in mid-Wales employs more than 100 people and every year consumes thousands of trees. And while food may be in surplus in Britain, timber is not. 3 million acres of upland Britain have been covered by conifers this century, but for some, this isn't enough. Lord Gibson Watt is just one forester and landowner who believes that forestry has a big future in Britain.
Now, we're looking down over there into the top of the Wye Valley, the heart of mid-Wales. And if you look across the river and look at the whole of that panorama, you'll see it's virtually all conifers.
He argues for more forestry, even if the proposed transfer of land from farming never actually happens.
I think there's a very strong argument for a bigger forest industry. Take first the money side. It's costing Britain 4.7 billion, not million, billion pounds a year to import from the rest of the world. And 2/3 of it is semi-processed stuff. Now, if we could use our own people, not only to grow it, but also to process it, then surely, economically, that would be very strong.
Lord Gibson Watt is proud of the forestry on his family estate. It has a blend of conifers, with Japanese larches contrasting with Sitka spruces and conforming to the contours of the hills. But this is by no means the only picture of modern upland forestry. Not far away in mid-Wales, in the Brecon Beacons, forestry wears a very different but far more typical face. This is just one conifer plantation in the Brecons. It has imposed on it vast blankets, obscuring the natural contours of the land. There are new plantations being put down in the very heart of the best scenery in the Brecons. But the conifer forests destroy the open landscape, and thus the whole point of designating the Beacons as a national park for the enjoyment of 7 million visitors a year.
What afforestation does, at least afforestation as we know it in this country, is to rather change that type of landscape. It introduces large blocks, large blobs onto the landscape, often quite unconnected with other elements of the landscape. So we have, instead of having large areas of flowing countryside, it gets disrupted by these blocks that seem awfully contrived and rather artificial.
People who turn regularly to the Brecon Beacons for recreation and walking are in no doubt where they prefer to walk.
Well, when we're rambling on open moorland, it's so invigorating, and there's a sense of freedom. And forestry tends to enclose the walkers within itself, and one loses this sense of freedom and looking all over the countryside and seeing miles. It's the open space that matters, really.
What happens to wildlife is that there is no wildlife. There are no birds, there are nothing. It is absolutely dead. You can be walking through the forest and you hear nothing. No, you can't hear any birds, you can't see any animals, because the forestry is so dense that it is dark and no animal wants to live there. So it is pointless.
Conifer forests destroy the habitat of many species, but the future of moorland birds causes acute concern. Hen harriers, merlins and golden plovers are threatened by the planting of conifers. So the forests have a major impact on the environment and wildlife of the uplands. strong then are the economic arguments for them? In fact, forestry is an industry heavily subsidised by both grants and tax relief. Until he resigned in protest at the damage it caused, Steve Tompkins was employed by a big forestry company.
When I hear this import argument, I always think of the case for reducing banana imports into this country, because we're 100% dependent on importing bananas. And if you wanted to, if you provided tax relief and grants so that 70% of the costs of growing bananas in this country were subsidised, then we could do that. And also, if the revenue from producing those bananas was tax-free, I'm sure you'd have people queuing up to grow bananas. We could even set up a banana commission to do it. But whether that would be in the national interest is a completely different question.
I believe forestry shows every sign of repeating the devastation and sheer pointless waste of modern agriculture. It will ruin the hills and the valleys and leach the magic out of our landscapes. Instead of subsidised and expensive barley and butter, it will give us subsidised and expensive timber. So the untrammelled power of rural landowners to exploit their holdings for gain has transformed our environment very much for the worse. But landowners don't only use their land to make money. They also use it to pursue private pleasure, just as their Norman predecessors did. Gerald Grosvenor, the 6th Duke of Westminster, is a keen sportsman, as was his Norman ancestor, Le Grosvenor. The great hunter was granted land in Britain by William the Conqueror in reward for fighting beside him. Gerald Grosvenor enjoys pheasant shooting and deer stalking, but his special love is grouse shooting.
Get off it. Pitch it on.
He has a vast grouse moor on his 22,000-acre estate in Lancashire, one of his 4 rural estates. The Ramblers Association has been campaigning for more access to his moors. Why does he keep people out, even when shooting isn't taking place?
There is no doubt that major disturbance during the springtime it would have a detrimental effect to the grouse. Now, you and I will agree to disagree on this, but I know it does, and I'm told by others that it doesn't. However, I'm absolutely clear on that fact. So the nesting time has to be... you're talking about a completely wild bird that needs its freedom and it needs its privacy. And I do suggest that during nesting times it's very important that that is kept quiet.
However, studies of grouse bags taken on moors where people are allowed to walk around freely undermine the Duke's arguments. The presence of walkers has had no effect on the bags. Landowners get no less pleasure from pheasant shooting. Indeed, it's an even more widespread activity. 10 million birds are reared and shot every year. Shoots like these are both a form of income and of pleasure for landowners. For the guns, wood and field are perfect habitats, as the birds are forced to fly high, giving time for a clear shot, and guns get a particular pleasure from bringing down a high-flying bird. And they're lovely habitats for us too. These mixtures of woodlands and open fields would be lovely to walk in, if only we could get into them. But landowners also claim that their pheasant shooting would be ruined if there was general public access. Yet, in the 70s, the British Field Sports Society ran packs of hounds through pheasant woods to see how much they disturbed the birds. They did so only momentarily. If pheasants are not rattled by foxhounds, they can readily put up with walkers. We did eventually find out a main reason for people being kept out of Wychwood Forest. Lord Rotherwick, in a letter to Oxfordshire County Council this year, states that a proposed public footpath would be near prime areas for the culling of deer and pheasant shooting. Wychwood Forest is in fact a kind of private pleasure ground for the shooting of game, and this means the public must be kept out. And in all Oxfordshire, only 111 acres out of the county's 27,000 acres of woodland are freely open to the public. Our countryside, then, has been for centuries in the hands of a relatively small group of people who've used it for their own benefit. Today, they are destroying many of its most attractive places, and they're keeping the rest of us away from many of the attractions that remain. It seems we can't win. Or does it? In fact, in Britain, there's a 1,000-year tradition of resistance to the landowners from those who do not own land. Lately, this tradition has been forgotten, but in our own century, the landless have won victories. In Part 2, I'm going to look at some of these past successes, and I'm going to put forward radical plans to change the balance of power in the countryside. Centuries' fight back against the landowners was provoked by their use of the land for private pleasure. In the early decades of this century, landowners enjoyed shooting on a scale even greater than today. Kings and lords killed thousands of birds in a day.
The guns are out again on the moors, and the unwary grouse is to have his annual shock, as the 12th ushers in the open season for shooting.
The huge moors were reserved almost exclusively for grouse shooting. The public were rigidly excluded.
Tramp, 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 the boys are marching, and the girls too, but they've nowhere to go. There are more Jacks and Jills than hills, and they're getting rather worried about it.
But after the Great War, there was a mounting desire from ordinary people trapped in the industrial cities to escape into the countryside, to renew themselves in the clean air.
Still they come. There's many a stout soul going over the hill. But look, there's a stranger in their midst, a motorcyclist who must be the only one who's set out tired. That's why he's not got so very far. A fine sight for a boot mender. But it will be a few
in the 20s and 30s, it's estimated that 30,000 people left Sheffield and Manchester alone every Sunday for the uplands and moors of the Peak District. It was on these grouse moors that the bitterest confrontations between landowners and landless took place.
So now to bath and bed with a week of work to follow, until once again they
on one spring Sunday in 1932, hundreds of walkers banded together, determined to walk upon the forbidden grouse moor of Kinder Scout. One of their leaders was a Manchester man named Benny Rothman.
I spoke to the ramblers in attendance and explained what our purpose was, and we gave them battle orders. The idea was that we would walk in a long straight line, and at a predetermined signal from whistles which we were carrying, we would right turn, and in a long straight wave we would scramble up onto Kinder. As we went up the hillside, a small group of keepers came to meet us waving sticks and tried to force the ramblers back. There were one or two minor skirmishes. We went on to Kinder itself, met up with a group of our colleagues both from Sheffield and Manchester. We had a bit of a victory meeting, and we went back to Hayfield, fully expecting that there would be further difficulties.
And difficulties there certainly were. Benny Rothman and 4 others were arrested and sent to jail, Benny for 4 months.
My understanding of a jury is that it should be representative of a cross-section of the public. The jury that convicted myself and my colleagues in 1932 consisted of 2 brigadier generals, 3 colonels, 2 majors, 3 captains and 2 aldermen. A court-martial couldn't have done it better.
The Great Kinder Scout mass trespass quickly became a legendary event in the long struggle between the landowners and the landless, with rallies to protest at the prison sentences. But in fact it had no immediate effect on opening up the grouse moors. What it did do was build up public awareness of the scandal of having millions trapped in cities but surrounded by open land.
This was Whitsun for 200,000 youth hostelers and 250,000 hikers, ramblers, walkers and what have you.
It wasn't until after the war that the landless got their partial reward. When the war was over, the people were keener than ever to cycle or walk in the countryside.
The weekend means the chance to dust the cobwebs from your mind and the soot from your lungs. Although the world goes by in a flash, you find there's peace and beauty just up the road. For Britain belongs to everybody over the weekend.
The post-war Labour government was imbued with the spirit of creating a new Britain which would sweep away the feudal principles of the old order. Seized with the ideal of meeting the real needs of the people, it did not forget their needs for recreation. In effect, it created a new deal for the countryside to clip landowners' wings. This had three main planks.
The bald head on the right is
First, it created a legal basis for rights of way like footpaths. Any landowner who blocked a public path could be prosecuted. Then councils were given powers to secure access to open land, including moors like Kinder Scout. Lastly, it passed the Town and Country Planning Act, which meant, among other things, that landowners had to seek permission before they could build or quarry. The promise held out in the New Deal for the countryside was not, however, to be fulfilled. The planning laws were not applied to farming and forestry because at the time these activities did not seem to threaten the landscape.
For the first time in history, we claimed in Britain to be operating a system of town and country planning. And that, of course, is a total misnomer, because it's really been a system of town planning. It's been a system of deciding how land is used inside towns and how far towns are allowed to sprawl into the countryside. And once you get to the edge of the urban sprawl, stopping it, really you move outside the system of town and country planning. You move into a system where the free-for-all for the owner of the land still survives.
And as for getting greater access to the countryside, the task of confronting landowners and farmers was left largely to the shire councils. And these were dominated by, yes, landowners and farmers. Not surprisingly, they made little use of their new access powers. The grand ideas of the post-war period have turned out to be inadequate, and what we need now is some new ones. The first change I want to put forward is to turn the laws of trespass on their head. At the moment, people can only walk legally in the countryside if they keep to rights of way or to areas where there is a sign or agreement saying that this is where they can go. If they stray off the path, they are trespassing. Now in Sweden, they have a law called allemansrätten. This gives people the legal right to walk anywhere in the countryside. They must only keep off limited areas, such as where crops or young trees are growing. I think we should have the Swedish system here. People should be free to walk anywhere in the countryside, unless there's a good reason for them not to. I'd like a new Act of Parliament to give people the right to walk in all woods, parkland, open moors and downs, along all lakes, rivers and coasts, and they could ramble along all field edges, farm tracks and forest paths. In my new social contract for the countryside, I'd call this Act the right to roam. Walkers would have to keep from certain kinds of land, around houses for instance, or land under crops. Landowners would be able to apply for exclusion orders, often temporary, if they could show that having people on the land would cause undue damage to it. Not that this will appease them. What do you think of the idea of a general right of access to rural land?
A poacher's paradise. How absolutely wonderful. Now, if everybody was perfect, marvellous. Nobody would do any harm. People wouldn't leave any gates open. They wouldn't poach the whatever it may be. They wouldn't steal your chickens. They wouldn't steal your sheep, which now and again happens in this part of the world. No, please. I'm all in favour of pathways, bridleways, public footpaths, But if you're going as far as that, then you're going to get the whole of the countryside up against you.
But I still think my idea of a right to roam is a good one. Look at the position here. It's the magnificent Luton Hoo estate. It's just a stone's throw from Luton town and its 160,000 people. Visible from the estate itself are the Vauxhall car works. You can even see Luton Airport itself. The town has few attractive public parks. Luton Hoo's owner does allow people to visit the Great House and its gardens for 6 months of the year, but most of the estate is off-limits all year round. The estate has very few public footpaths. The beautiful fields, woods and lake, which townspeople would surely enjoy, are out of bounds. The owner is Nicholas Phillips. He inherited the house and 4,000 acres from his grandfather, Sir Julius Ferner. I asked him why he didn't allow people to walk freely in his estate.
It's not probably so much the person who wants to walk around the lake peacefully. It's the fact that living near urban areas, you do in fact suffer from many of the problems of those urban areas, such as vandalism and destruction. I mean, have people going into young plantings, possibly leaving the gates open, which lets the rabbits in, and you find 5 years of patient work to establish a young crop has been lost overnight.
But not very far away there stands a little wood which ought to be in a terrible state, if Nicholas Phillips is correct in his argument that open access leads to great damage. This beautiful beechwood in the Chilterns is only 16 acres in size, but 6 years ago it was opened up so anyone can walk freely in it. It was bought by the naturalist and writer Richard Mabey.
Have any of you ever seen a badger? They are actually quite shy things. You see them sometimes going across the road at night.
Today he goes out of his way to encourage people, like these fifth formers, to come to his wood and understand its secrets.
The best badger set you'll ever see. You can see how they've actually dug right into the chalk, not just scooped the earth out, but they've cut an arch, almost like stonemasons. I come now on a sunny day, particularly in bluebell time. There are always people walking here. The nicest thing I've seen in here was to come in one spring morning and see these two pools of white light, and they proved to be the straw hats of a couple of ladies who were painting the bluebells. And I thought it was their wood for that moment, so I left them to it and walked round a long way.
Yes, but essentially anybody is allowed to walk on any track, or indeed anywhere throughout this wood, not just people who are helping you to harvest the timber and manage the wood for wildlife.
That's right. There's no official footpath, but that is understood that anyone can come in and can use the wood in any way that's responsible.
But has that caused problems of vandalism and damage?
Not at all so far. I mean, even though we are quite close to some pretty big towns, I mean, Hempstead New Town is only about 5 miles away, so we've got a catchment area of maybe 500,000 people within I suppose a 10-mile radius. But in those 6 years, the only acts of vandalism I can think of is in the first year when some of the local horse riders got a bit frisky coming up this slope, and horses are the one thing we don't have in now, and one solitary occasion when I think a group of children in their summer holidays came and cut down a tree, and I honestly can't blame them because it's what we adults have been doing here quite a lot anyway.
He believes it's arrogant to think that an ancient wood can belong to him alone. So what is his response, as a naturalist and landowner, to the right to roam?
I think it would be 100% support on both counts. It would seem to me to greatly enhance the appreciation and enjoyment of natural history by the people of this country. And secondly, it would seem to me to put into practice what I believe actually to be natural law. I think that in their hearts, most of the people in this country support that as well. They think that the surface of their own country is a place that they have the right to walk on.
But is it just the owners of small woods who need have no fears of the right to roam? Farmers, with their energies devoted to cultivating the land, might be expected to have most cause for concern. This tractor is working on an 800-acre farm near King's Lynn in Norfolk. Its owner encourages visitors and has actually created new rights of way on the farm.
My experience is that people are really very nervous about walking, particularly on agricultural land like this farm, and worried about whether they're allowed to be there. And we felt that by creating public rights of way on an ordnance survey map, we would actually help encourage people to come here and walk around the farm.
What do you think of the idea of a general right to roam in the countryside?
I think it would be very good, and I think if we could change people's attitude to the countryside, and if they could see it as somewhere which they were free to go and welcomed, that would be a tremendously important step forward.
But if people like these walkers on Lord Melchett's farm are going to have a right to roam in the countryside, some steps are needed to make sure the countryside is worth walking in. One much canvassed reform is to extend planning controls to cover major changes to the landscape. It's argued that these controls are essential for democratic reasons.
The case for bringing the kind of activities that contemporary agriculture and forestry are engaged in under planning control seems to me to be quite overwhelming. We're talking, when we talk about the countryside, about our countryside, just as when we talk about a beautiful town, we think we're talking about a bit of our heritage, but the Cotswolds or the Chilterns or the North York Moors or whatever are our countryside. And yet, we as individual consumers of that countryside have absolutely no say in it.
Extending planning controls does, however, have its drawbacks. It's negative. It would do nothing to bring back the hedges and meadows to devastated landscapes, and it would not offer any financial encouragement to landowners to preserve attractive features. So while extra planning controls might well help the countryside, I would prefer to see a more radical measure adopted, and one that would involve a real break with the past. This plan would be the second plank of my social contract for the countryside. It's for a new land tax to redistribute landowning income in the public interest. To see how the land tax might work, we can look at Lord Melchett's farm. It started with hedges and copses, and now he's increasing the planting. These farm workers are extending a small broad-leaved wood. They're planting beech and oak in tree tubes that protect the saplings in their first years of life. And Lord Melchett has, of course, opened up his farm to the public, and he's refrained from draining a marshland rich in wildlife, despite the extra money it could earn him. For each of the features which enhanced wildlife or recreation, Lord Melchett would receive tax, so he'd be positively rewarded for keeping a farm that's kind to wildlife and welcoming to people.
We do badly need some change in the financial message which farmers get, the financial incentives. I mean, it is ridiculous that small areas of woodland on this farm cost us money and do nothing, in a way more important, do nothing to help me continue to provide jobs on this farm for the 5 other people that work here and the 5 families that depend on it. Whereas the land this tractor's ploughing, which will provide more cereals to go into surplus, I get paid a lot of money every year by the government.
Where would these land tax payments to Lord Melchett come from? Well, not from ordinary taxpayers. Rather, the landowners would be funding the scheme themselves. Some of Lord Melchett's East Anglian neighbours could contribute for a start. Prairie farmers would have to pay tax because they farm in huge fields without hedges and woods and with little regard to wildlife. Only if Nicholas Thornhill decided to change his ways could he receive payments. Equally, the estate owners who clothe the hills in conifers would find the economic odds shifting against them. The land tax would work within the planning system, with the government setting the framework and fine-tuning done by local authorities. And so the destiny of the countryside would be determined by the whole community. These changes I've outlined would alter utterly the dynamics of power in the land, and now is the time to make them. In the next decade, landowners may have to take several million acres out of agricultural production. Left to their own devices, they will turn to building, conifer planting, or whatever else meets their age-old demands for wealth and pleasure. Instead, we can have the kind of countryside we want, if we take this chance to make them yield a little of their power. Ask your MPs where they stand on the countryside. Support the organisations which defend wildlife, landscape and public access. Form local groups to fight individual battles. We can have our rightful share of power in the land if only we struggle to recover it. Now, more than ever before, the land is too important to be left to the landowners.